Hi everyone. I want to welcome you to the Central Square Theater, who is graciously hosting us this evening. I want to thank my incredible board, and I want to thank in particular Steve Campbell and Frank Cronin, the fundraising committee back there. And then the sponsors for this evening, and we have displayed them all over the place, so hopefully you know who they are, and if you look in your programs, you'll see them as well. So when we were discussing this, Jim said something about that I was a First Amendment absolutist, and I
did?
I thought it was a good word, because I did used to be a First Amendment absolutist. I'm afraid to admit that to everyone here. Back in the early days of CCTV, we had First Amendment issues like, some MIT students who were doing a same-sex video and using a banana to put a condom on and stuff like that. That was fairly easy to deal with. We've had Roger Nicholson cursing on the live set. Now all of that looks very, very tame, doesn't it? A few years ago, I was in Harvard Square and I saw somebody driving in a pickup truck with a big Confederate flag flying and blaring out, racist stuff out of his windows. And I said, things are changing now, And now, instead of on the live set hearing curse words, we hear sometimes racist tropes. So things have changed, and it makes me very uncomfortable to think about myself as an absolutist at this point, and I'm suspecting that there are a lot of people in this room who also are feeling uncomfortable, and that's why we're here this evening. We're very, very fortunate to have Jim Braude, who is a co-host of Boston Public Radio and host of Greater Boston.
Yeah. That was pathetically tepid applause. I'm serious. Oh my God.
Wow.
Thank you for warming them up for me.
Everybody's ready now, right? I always have to look at Ceasar's. He's the professor of practice of civic design at MIT. I always have to read that because I can't keep all those words kind of in my mind. I want to also quote my friend Reverend Irene Monroe for saying that these are two guys with really beautiful minds, and I think it's going to be really a very interesting conversation. So they're going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to engage the audience. We are recording, so I would really like you to use a mic when you speak. So I'll be running around and sticking a mic in your face. So thank you so much for being here. And
are you introducing him, or what are you doing?
She did.
I did.
You did already?
Yeah, and I got no applause.
I said,
You took it all. What can I say? This is actually really great. So neither one of us is hosting. We just decided we're going to have this dialogue about things I think we both deal with in really different ways. And so one of the things that I'm really struggling with, and it is a struggle for me right now, and Susan said a little bit about it, which is really this notion of where are the limits, right? Where are the limits around what we are able to say to each other, and particularly what are those limits in relationship to kind of the technology that we have? I kind of believe a lot that given where we are in this world right now, people need a venue to kind of give voice to their experience in the world, and as ugly in the ways that they may do that, but at the same time, for us to have a society that works together, we have to figure out, I don't want to say civil conversations, but conversations that actually make sense. And I struggle with this question of, even though I play around with media and stuff like that, about the way in which media is really, I think the new media have really deteriorated our ability to do that. There's some nice exceptions that people have created, but as a whole, I think we've actually, let me put it another way. I think the real question for me around this issue of free speech is how do we reinstitute responsibility in it? Not so much what are the spaces where we can be free and what we can say, but where do we get our guidance around responsibility, both to each other and to the greater society?
I think there's a step before. Obviously, one can't disagree with the notion that one is to try to find some equilibrium or something about responsibility. But there's a threshold issue, I think, before you get to how do people use their speech responsibly. The threshold issue is how does everybody get a right to speak? And while we can all, the pap of everybody's the right to speech in the First Amendment here is pretty meaningless if you can't exercise it in a meaningful way. It's sort of analogous to, what's a good analogy? The right to choose is great unless you're in a state where the one abortion clinic is 300 miles away, or you have health insurance for the first time in your life but you can't afford to use it.
Right.
So the first step, I think, is trying to figure out how everybody gets an opportunity to meaningfully exercise their speech. And we talk a lot about social media, but as you probably know much better than I, there are a ton of people who don't have access to social media. Right. So right away, they don't even have an opportunity. And even if you do have an opportunity to be heard, again, these, I guess, are my thoughts about the pre-responsibility consideration, is you, even if you can exercise your right in a meaningful way, you also have to be able to figure out a way to be heard, and not drowned out by louder voices, whether they're louder because of their funding or their power or those sort of things. My wife is sitting there, Chris Rondeau, and she would say, "I'm not a very good listener, and I'm not in my personal life, unfortunately. I am a great listener in my professional life."
I think that's why they have us up here together. They have the same profile.
But so I guess the question is, how do you create, for me at least, before you get to the responsibility thing, I'm not trying to be dismissive of it at all, is how do you create a relatively level playing field so that everybody's in the game? That's one. And then two, I think, which is only a micro piece of the responsibility issue. While I am pretty much an absolutist, even though I could probably be pushed in another direction on an issue or two, I am an anti-anonymity absolutist too. One of the real problems with the new way we communicate over the last 20 years is the ability to be hateful and oppressive and crushing of people is to hide behind the anonymity. And so I don't know if anybody, one of the first, Dan Kennedy, who works part-time at GBH and does this great blog and teaches in the Northeast, and he was one of the first people in the country who, when comments were posted on his website, dankennedy.net, decided maybe 6 or 7 years ago that no one could post anonymous comments anymore. And while it was a small step, I thought it was an important step. Some people were criticizing him, saying you're limiting my speech, but others were saying you are creating a greater sense, to use your word, of responsible speech by virtue of the fact that people have to own up to their words.
Actually, that's a really good example of what I mean by kind of the responsibility. You know, the responsibility for things that you say and having to own that, and one, not being able to be anonymous, I think is a good part of that. But
are you talking about self-enforced responsibility or societally enforced?
Self-enforced responsibility.
Self-enforced
responsibility. You know, because I think it's a challenge for us in this society. You know, in our U.S.-centric world, you know, we are really a rights-based society, not a responsibilities-based society. There's some societies that are responsibility-based and not rights-based, and I think we could use a little more of that kind of responsibility sense. But to this place about kind of hate speech, I mean, I have to admit, I'm a little more terrified now of things that happen in public and talk than I was before. So today I got on the train, and I'm trying to separate behavior from speech right now. But I got on the train today, I'm coming on the red line from Harvard Square down to Kendall. And there's this guy on the train, and he is with this person, and he's decided to have this conversation with them that was basically sexist, xenophobic. He was just like going off on everybody and everything. We're on a crowded train, and my question is, does he have the right to speak like that in this space, right? And what is my responsibility. Now, responsibility is what I'm saying. I felt my own sense being kind of my world kind of colliding in because I didn't know where this was going to go, because I think that barrier between, or that bridge between what someone will say and what someone will do sometimes is really thin, and somebody can say something really hateful and it doesn't take long to provoke them into action. Even if you just say, would you please calm down, then all of a sudden it becomes a bad or an aggressive thing. And I was really concerned because this person was, in some sense, in the middle of these women, right? He kind of had himself positioned there. He was talking across to somebody else. And in that instance, right, this question of, okay, this person can say what they need to say, but I actually don't think they should have the right to say this right now, under these conditions, in this space where people didn't choose to be in this space for that kind of activity. Maybe there'd be another space where that's okay. But I wonder if part of this is being able to have places where it's okay to have certain kinds of speech and places where it's not okay, where there can be limits. And you can say like, no, we don't want to have that here. But what does that mean in kind of these quasi-public spaces? I don't know.
Well, you know, when you said you heard sexist, homophobic, whatever you said, misogynistic, xenophobic, I thought you were riding on the subway with Donald Trump, which literally would have been incredible. And so nice. You say to yourself, what if it's not okay in that space, is it okay in the most public space in the world?
Right.
And while it's not okay, I would argue in either place, I would say is it both a practical and maybe a political issue. I think the answer is that maybe the way you deal with that is by considering you have a responsibility to others. Mm-hmm. So that one person who feels assaulted by that speech on that subway car or the speech from the president on the White House lawn doesn't have to try to deal with that on his or her own. If I had a choice between relying on my fellow human beings to do the right thing versus shutting down that speech, I'd choose my fellow human beings. I told you when I met you that I'm not looking to see if Nancy Pelosi is about to be sworn in as president, which after today's hearing, I wrote down, I watched your, I couldn't take Jim Jordan for like 5 more minutes today. I was going to have a stroke, and we were broadcasting the whole hearing live. And so what I did, which is totally irresponsible, my boss would be, I actually watched your TED Talk for 15 minutes. By the way, I've never met him before. I would really urge you to watch this TED Talk. It is great. And you close with, can you create, your final words were, well, I'm going to get this slightly wrong, but you'll fix it here. Can you create a micro inclusion before you get to your street, is your final words. Right? Okay, first, would you mind telling people what a micro inclusion is, and I'll tell you why I brought it up?
Okay, so I was actually talking about this thing about how we have this language about microaggressions, right? And there's a lot of that. We know what that is when people do these little things that are really aggressive. They're small. And I was just saying we actually need to counterbalance those with really actually doing these micro-inclusions, these small acts that let other people know they're part of us and they're included.
Well, essentially what I think, the reason I thought of it, I was hoping there'd be an opportunity to mention it, is that was an opportunity for a micro-inclusion on the part of your fellow human beings, I would argue, rather than shutting it down. And the reason why I am nervous about shutting it down, even though I don't have to worry about being the recipient of that kind of language in most parts of the world, unlike you and other people here, is I'm a big slippery slope person too, and I really worry. Susan, wherever you are, Susan sent us both of us a survey today, or a study from Knight Foundation? Yeah, and they were talking about kids, teenagers I think, and who felt that the First Amendment has allowed speech to go too far. And I think you won't be surprised that boys and white kids disagreed with the statement, and girls and kids of color were more inclined to agree with the statement, and more inclined as a result to say, let's figure out a way to shut that down. That makes me incredibly nervous, and it is not because I'm not sympathetic to those who are at the receiving end, like you were on the subway, or like those kids, the girls and the kids of color are, but if you come from my perspective, which is it's really dangerous to shut down almost any kind of speech, and I'm happy to mention exceptions if people care, then it seems to me you have to figure out a way to counter it. And I mean, I'll give you another example, by the way. I'm not one of those people, this whole Twitter, Facebook thing, since you started with social media. First of all, Twitter agreeing not to take political ads is moronic, since political ads are almost not, it's sort of like me saying I'm not going to take political ads on my social media, which it means nothing. Right. Facebook, it would mean something, but the fear that I have about that, even though I'm no fan of Zuckerberg, is that's almost like an incumbent protection tool. If political ads were shut down off Facebook, that means that people that have very little money who try to challenge people with entrenched power probably won't have a place to have their voice heard. And so, this is not my thought, but something I read a few days ago, is maybe rather than shutting down Facebook, you ban micro-targeting, which is what Facebook has elevated to an art form. And in micro-targeting, your ability to have people rally around you, literally or figuratively, to defend against hateful, deceitful, untruthful speech is virtually non-existent. But if there's no micro-targeting, you have narrowly dealt, in my opinion, with the problem. You know where I'm going?
It's interesting because this is it's like an old story, right? Because I was thinking back when I was about the WLBT case in Jackson, Mississippi, right, in the 60s, where you had the situation where there's this broadcast system, which was part of the NBC network. I think it was part of the NBC network. And they were purposely not broadcasting any coverage of anything that was going on in the civil rights movement, right, in Jackson, Mississippi, right? Okay, you get this, right? 40% of the people were black in Jackson, Mississippi. The broadcast station would not broadcast anything. And it was this other, I kind of think about that today because what happened is that, the United Church of Christ, Reverend Parker, who was head of their communications, put forth this suit that I think it went to the Fifth Circuit. Actually, Warren was the person who, Justice Warren was the person who decided the case. So it's kind of really interesting. But it went through a lot of petitions and stuff to basically say, was it right did the station actually have to provide the opportunity for the local community to know all that was going on? And did it have to provide space for alternative political candidates, right? Because there were black people. And they lost on several different occasions, but kept pushing and pushing. Finally won. Actually, it was the first television station in the country to lose its license, right? The very first one to lose its license, and actually got turned over and was run by a consortium that the United Church of Christ and others set up, and it became the first black-owned broadcasting station in the South. I bring that up because I think there's something about this notion of, and I guess I'm saying I'm agreeing with you, is that we have to be really careful because the power can shift quickly. And if we don't create and open up these spaces where people just have to contend with the fact that there are a lot of differences, it's very easy then to shut things down from one side or the other.
Well, this has become almost a trite phrase, but Ray, if you remember when Ahmadinejad went to Columbia years ago, and there was all this uproar, a lot of students at Columbia were saying, don't let him come. Obviously, tyrannical regime, and they oppress virtually everybody. And the decision was made by the guy who was then the president, who I think went on to be president of New York City Public Library. I can't think of his name. It's not Bollinger, whatever his name is. He basically said, we're going to have this guy come. And Ahmadinejad in his speech, all this hateful kind of stuff. And the response of the president was in advance, well, the only way we allowed him to speak was if he was willing to answer questions, which he was. Does anybody remember what the great question was? No. One of the first questions? The president of the school turns to Ahmadinejad and says, you persecute, you kill gay people in your country. It's been documented by the United Nations. How do you respond to that? And Ahmadinejad turned to him, he says, that's not true. We don't have any gay people in Iran. And this was exactly what the reaction was.
Right.
And it was proof to me that the president had made the right choice.
Right.
Because with more speech, well, that's one. This is not planned, but this is also amazing that you mentioned Jackson, Mississippi. I was a legal services lawyer in the South Bronx, and I was the president of the union that represented legal services people around the country, lawyers, secretaries, paralegals, when Ronald Reagan proposed abolition of legal services for the poor, and we basically worked with a freshman Congressman, Barney Frank, and Ted Kennedy to keep the program alive, which we did. We, from all over the country, flew to Jackson, Mississippi, because the Klan was threatening one of the best young legal services lawyers in the country. His name was Lou Myers. He's since died, unfortunately. And all these tough kids from the North were talking tough on the buses, and almost all of us are white, by the way, it was some diversity, who went down to march. And it was we were intending, the goal was to have a counter march to a Klan march. It was a Klan march against the legal services program in Jackson at the time. And we're on a school bus going to the site of the Klan march, and again, we're all tough talking, and like we know what we're doing. And as we turn the corner to where the rally is, Klansmen, hooded, are surrounding the police station in Jackson with rifles. And all of us tough kids, you can imagine, literally in 2 seconds, we're like puddles of goo on the floor. But the reason I tell the story is when I met with Lou Myers, this young, brilliant lawyer whose life was far too short, and I said, that was outrageous. They should be banned from there. Lou Myers, who was the target of the demonstrations of the Klan, said, you're wrong. And he says, well, they surely should not be able to be armed. There's no question about that. As painful as it is for me, my family, and my coworkers, we have to fight to defend their right to be there. And I have to say, that was really hard for me to digest as a young kid lawyer, but I'm sure I couldn't have had the courage or strength to conclude what he did, but I think he was right. And what his response, where he's sitting here today, is what we both said the last couple of minutes. The way to respond to that kind of thing is sort of communally. Is whether it's kids from the North joining with legal services, secretaries, lawyers, and paralegals from North Mississippi Rural Legal Services, or whatever it is. That's one. The other thing, if I may, is someone who talks to hundreds of people a week on the phone. Right. What's being done with this tape, by the way? We have some really smart, informed listeners. We have some people who I think barely know what planet they are on. Yep. And I don't mean, and by the way, I don't mean their politics. It doesn't matter. No. The lack of civic, people talk about lack of civic education in schools. It's not just kids. It is adults who understand so little about both their rights and responsibilities that it is painful. Almost all of their bias, at least, I know it's a grand statement, but it's a short program, so almost all of the bias that we hear on the radio, and it's a little bit of a grand statement, is a function of having no idea what, in my opinion, what people are talking about, because I don't think the society values educating people about their rights and responsibilities, and all these kinds of, I said to you when I met you on the phone the other day, one of my favorite things, and this says it all to me, the Minneapolis something in 2006, the Tribune Foundation, whatever, did a survey of 1,000 people, I think around the country, but it may have been Minnesota, I'm not sure. And they asked people if they could name all 5 freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment. Can people do it here? I would bet the answer is no. Can anybody name all 5? You can? Yeah. What's the 5th that everybody forgets?
Petition for...
Exactly, that's the one. Okay, and then they asked the same 1,000 people, could they name the 5 members of the Simpson family, meaning Homer Simpson?
Homer Marge.
Well, we don't have to do it. 22% of the recipients could name all 5 members of the Simpson family. 1 out of 1,000. You. 1 out of 1. This is serious. 1 out of 1,000 could name all 5 freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment. So I guess what I'm saying is, one place where you go to begin to build a responsibility to speak up and speak up on behalf of others is by knowing more about what your responsibilities are and rights are in society, which I think most people don't know. I think almost everything is shoot from the hip these kinds of days, and I think it's really
Yeah, but so that raises a really interesting question for me, is what do we do in the meantime? Put it this way. It would be great if we could actually rapidly move to a place where we could educate everyone and they would get that. In the meantime, what we have is a system that's designed with the idea that actually people will be good actors, but they're not good actors. Mm-hmm. And so then we're asked to kind of bear with the fact that they're not good actors, even though we have this system for good actors, and then we don't actually prepare them, which means we are stuck with this thing. So perhaps there is some need to modify the system given the character.
How would you modify the system?
Well, you do that. I don't do No, I had to think about that. I'm not sure. I actually am not sure, but it's. Let me say one thing about that. So I think part of it is that for me is really making this distinction. I think I talked about this in the email when we were going back and forth. I think there are 3 ways for me to think about my need to have my voice in life, right? So part of it is for me to be able to be, or anyone, and I think anyone should have this, to be able to kind of validate their own lived experience in the world through talking about it, through speaking about it, whatever that may be. Everyone needs that. And I think society needs people to be able to, actually this friend of mine says, to be able to struggle and dialogue around kind of, traditions that are actually separate, bind them up, and interests that separate them. So society needs people to be in some kind of dialogue and be able to have free talk. But I don't think those two things are the same, right? And perhaps, there's a way in which a society that really wants to be free needs to have some threshold, some way of saying, we're going to create the conditions so people can have a certain kind of conversation. Because, we don't even facilitate most of our public conversations, right? We don't even that little simple thing we don't do. We set things up so that actually they are bound to be divisive, right? That's how we set up our public hearings. We set up everything to actually support division. So maybe part of the issue is we have to really rethink about how do we start redesigning some of these things where we know the public's come together, so it doesn't necessarily have to move people into that space of division, because I think that's what we do automatically. And the other side of that is, and this is going to be my thing about television, particularly broadcast television, is it contributes to this notion about the public being ignorant. I actually think people are smarter than we give them credit for, but the venues in which we allow them to speak then actually push out some really bad behaviors.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that, when's the last time you've actually seen television represent just ordinary people having a reasonable conversation about international politics? You don't see it, right? Our message in our medium is that there are certain people who can do that, and the public can't be trusted to do that. And so in that context, we're really kind of enforcing this notion that they're bad actors, they're going to act bad, so therefore we have to protect ourselves against them. But I wonder if we actually started realizing that mediums like The Simpsons, that medium actually has a power to actually have people remember and shift something different, and then purposely say, well, one of our responsibilities with this medium is to actually model, in some ways, different ways that people can actually be engaged, and to show that ordinary people can actually have do have, because I've had lots of experiences where that happened, that people of different classes and stuff, and races, can actually engage in these conversations together.
Well, let me just say a couple of thoughts. One, I'm not sure, I agree with the concept, even though I'm not sure broadcast television is the venue. But I guess a couple of things. One, getting back to what I said at the beginning, I think the first step is to work really hard to give everybody a relatively equal start. And I don't mean this as naively as it sounds. I know there's still Citizens versus Citizens United and all that sort of stuff. But for starters, and this is not something that even extremists of any, this is something everybody could agree on. Get everybody on the internet, get everybody trained, get everybody having access so that everybody has a cheap forum to speak beyond to their spouse or kids or coworkers. That's number one. Number two, I'm sorry to keep citing my wife, and I'm going to get this slightly wrong because, and I'm sure you'll correct me, so say it out loud. One of the things she talks a lot about, she's maybe the best union organizer who's ever lived, organized Harvard years ago. Well, you are. And part of what you talk about, make sure I get this right, is you work really hard in one-on-one organizing to give people an opportunity to tell their story, right? Isn't that storytelling is the key to, and not only does she encourage people to tell their story, but Chris and her coworkers and other organizers actually listen to those stories. You have an opportunity to speak and an opportunity to listen, which gets to the Bob Putnam bowling alone notion. Is they're not social institutions. This is, I think, an easier step than going from zero to, I know you didn't mean literally just broadcast TV, is to focus on creating sort of safe, comfortable, social place. CCTV is a perfect example, frankly, of that kind of thing, a variation on a theme, but a place where obviously people can speak and be heard. And what's this, Bob Putnam, bowling alone is almost everybody is bowling alone. Most social institutions are broken down. There aren't many new unions in this country. People don't bowl together. They do bowl alone, not in leagues. But it seems to me a step that's manageable is trying to work hard on the ground level to create social institutions, some small, some larger, some really large, that give people an opportunity to be with other people who will be respectful of them. Their strength is built, their confidence is built, and so maybe their ability and willingness to tell their story, to speak on a whole, and to come to your defense, by the way, and I don't mean just the you, the generic you will be greater if they feel that they've had an opportunity to sort of grow their skills. I mean, my sense is this, what is Obama, I know everybody's angry at Obama about his incrementalism thing the other day. We don't have to, we don't have to get into that. Well, we don't. But what is his line? Don't let the good be the perfect be the enemy of the good. We could all think bigger and would like to get to the end point a lot faster, but it seems to me when you're talking about people's ability to speak and be heard, the question is what can you do that's realistic to begin to crack the door open so that people feel possibility. And again, I think things like this wonderful place, CCTV and others, are those kinds of things that we could replicate and cause people to feel stronger and, as I say, more willing and able to speak. So
I absolutely agree with that. And the only addition I'd make to that is I also think at the same time it has to start to happen. Those kinds of systems allow and support people being in relationship with each other. But some of these institutions that we have, the existence, have to also be part of that. Because people have to actually experience that in relationship to institutions also. And it's, a very simple thing would be just to think about how can any city council actually change the way it does hearings and conversations and presenting and stuff so that it actually allows people to actually speak and have their voice heard and use it as that forum. We run this podcast series called The Move, and we had this one city planner, Winter Joseph, on it. And he says, when we go to public meetings, one of the things that happen in the city council is everybody's scared that the person who's going to come in and start hollering and screaming, because they're mad at everything. And he says, but the reality is they should be mad. And actually their screaming is a reasonable response to what's going on. So instead of shutting it down, we actually should say that's actually part of the process. And maybe we need to have town halls for venting, because if people aren't able to vent, they're not going to be able to move forward to do other kinds of things. So I think there's some institutional work we need to do.
By the way, I totally agree with you. When I was a city councilor, I did want to shut them down. So that's the only, I'm trying to be honest.
Okay, see, here's a limit of free speech. It's all good until they come after me. What's happening in the audience?
We're enthralled by the conversation.
I don't know.
Yep.
So, Cesar, you opened by talking about, you started talking about responsible speech. And when you're talking now about everybody getting all the speech out, talk more about how we assure or how we encourage or whatever that the speech is responsible. And what responsible means.
Yeah. So in that instance, I didn't mean so much that the speech is responsible, but that person is responsible for their speech. All right. And I think that's really hard. That's why I love that you kind of talked about the kind of the organizing effort in building kind of social relationships with people, because it's actually hard to do that out of relationship. And that's one of the things one of our problems in society. We're so much out of relationship with each other that therefore we don't feel some sense of responsibility to each other. And so therefore it's really easy to harm the other, right? Because we have no connection to them. There's something else. So for me, it's more about that. It's about what's my responsibility around what I say and its impact to the other person. And not that I have an answer to that, because I mess it up all the time. But for me, it's an inquiry.
But in some levels, when you hear Ceasar say, people, you got to in part focus on the speaker being more responsible. And when you first said it, I'm sort of shaking my head like that's an impossible goal. But you know what I've learned from my 20 years in radio is I've had callers from when I was in commercial radio, now at GBH, who've been calling the show for 20 years. Wow. And a lot of them have changed a lot in those 20 years. And some of the angriest, most irresponsible people have become less angry and semi-responsible, I think, because they were treated relatively respectfully when they spoke. Yeah. And this may be a grand statement to make again, but it seems to me that a lot of the worst speakers and most dangerous speakers are ones who have felt that no one has ever listened, that no one has ever heard what they had to say. And I'm not Pollyanna enough to think, if you treat people respectfully, the most hateful of souls are all going to become loving. But yet again, it's like if you provide a forum, the forum may be a club, it may be a radio show, it may be your church or your synod, whatever the hell it is. If you're willing to let people say their piece, and it may be painful in the short run, my experience at least has been on the radio, where again, we talk to a lot of people, they become much more reasonable when they are not dismissed. Yeah. As we often tend, and I do too, to dismiss people with whom I am not in agreement. So,
I respectfully disagree. Isn't that what Rush Limbaugh and these forums are, where people feel empowered to have hate speech?
Well, but he's talking to the same people. No, I respectfully disagree with you. No, I'm talking about people who don't share a worldview. I am, again, probably in my personal life, far less tolerant than I try to be in my professional life. If people, the fact that I give an audience to somebody who agrees with my worldview, like Rush Limbaugh gives an audience to somebody who agrees with his worldview, doesn't advance anything. What I think does advance something is if a liberal called Rush Limbaugh and was not shut down or hung up on, which he or she would be, or if a right-leaning person were to call our show, and even if we said we don't agree with what you're saying and we were troubled by what you're saying, we're going to listen to it.
You do that every day.
We do, we do. So that's the difference, I guess I'm saying, is it's easy and doesn't advance anything. I don't mean you shouldn't talk to people who agree with you, but that isn't what I meant about cracking through. I meant cracking through by being tolerant of those who are not on the same page. That's what I meant. Okay? Okay. Right to petition the government for grievances. Is that what you're going to say? Hello, Irene Monroe.
Hi there. I have one question here. I think it's wonderful when you can get people together and have responsible conversation, even though you respectfully disagree. But I want to know, where is the state in this, and where's the responsibility in terms of the state? We know that in a theater, you cannot yell out fire. falsely, right. Thank you. Right. Okay. There's a sense of responsibility here. I think it's wonderful that you can, because what I hear when you say, well, we're going to have this sort of, multicultural democracy of talking to one another, but there are those of us who don't want to talk across our differences. And while Rush is only talking to his particular demographic group, it's not even a dog whistle. It's how it carries out behaviorally in society. I want to know, where is the government to protect this? And what I mean by this is like, you may hit me. Rest assured, I'm gonna whip your ass. But no, you may hit me, but because I'm black or whatever. But there's a hate crime on the books that will make you responsible for what you do. So I'm asking it within that context. Mm-hmm. Where's the state responsible?
Well, by the way, I can give you my 2 cents. I'm pretty comfortable with where the state is now if it actually enforced the laws that exist. I mean, not only can you not yell fire when it's not true in a crowded theater, you can't incite violence by your speech. And there's been a lot of debates about some of the tweets from Donald Trump, and should Twitter be forced to take them down? So if people in power, formal power, enforced what is, I think we have a pretty good state of affairs. The problem is, do they? And the answer is you and we. Irene, by the way, is a regular on a radio show, one of the most popular segments we do every single Monday at about, what time are you on?
Around 1-ish, I guess.
About 1 o'clock. I think we have to work harder to have the state, as you call it, enforce what is. I don't think we need that much more, frankly. You there or you're not?
I'm there, and I'm always a little bit skeptical of who's in control of the state.
Of course, right, of course.
But yeah.
So in the spirit of, it's wonderful that we're having these conversations, and I think we need more places to have those conversations. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot is this idea, you mentioned Putnam's Bowling Alone, and in this moment we're talking about big structural change. But when I think about the structural change that's necessary to get to places where we're not bowling alone, I think of the fact that we don't have time. And so when we see the decline in civic engagement, we're also looking at the rise in the working hour. We're looking at the decline in unions. If people aren't going to their churches, their synagogues, their community groups, it's partly because they have no time left to do it. And so I wonder, when we're talking about this sort of decline in civility, the rise in hate, whether it isn't all looked at, if we aren't really looking at the decline in face-to-face interaction, time to do it. I just wondered your thoughts on that.
So I think, it's really true that there are, we have kind of shrunk the space for opportunities for people to come together. I don't actually totally agree with Putnam. I actually think Putnam wasn't correct. I actually believe people have their networks and have their relationships, but they actually form them in very different ways and not in traditional ways that we kind of looked at them. But aside from that point, I actually, I don't think that's necessarily an excuse, because people aren't living in a bubble, right? And the question is, where people have interactions with people, what are we doing in those spaces that actually encourage them? I mean, have you ever gotten on a bus with a bus driver who decides this is his community or her community, and they're going to make people talk and engage? That's a very different experience, isn't it? Than when you get on the one where the person's grumpy and doesn't want to have anything to do with anyone, or the one who's just silent. So one is taking action to say, this is actually a space where people are captured. We can actually do something in this space to actually start in little ways to make those micro inclusions, to have people connect with each other. So I think we let ourselves off the hook around the places and spaces where people can do that. I kind of have this philosophy when we do community engagement work that says, in actuality, people shouldn't have to do anything more than what they normally do in their life to start participating in public life, because they're in the public by virtue of their life, right? And so then the thing is, are we valuing those places where people come together and do things, and are we moving our opportunities and the issues and opportunities for people to engage in those places? People buy groceries, they buy them late at night, they buy them in the middle of the day. Why aren't those places in which these work happen? So I think there are more opportunities. I just think they're different spaces, and we're not used to them. And I also think people are working too much. They don't have enough time. I'm not discounting that. But maybe we need to figure out how to use these where people are right now. That's, the primary thing around organizing. You got to get people where they are, right? And if they're, where they are physically and where they are in their heads and hearts too. Yes, I'm sorry.
I know this is another incredibly trite thought, but say it anyway, is as wonderful as social media is. I mean, part of the problem is, we talk when something huge is happening, and we're all, I assume everybody's saying, why, in France, or in Montreal, they raise college tuition in a public school by $1 a semester, and there are 300,000 people on the streets. I mean, here, I know there have been great things on climate and women's marches, but there's so many atrocities where we tweet our objection. That's part one. And part two is, I totally agree that people are overwhelmed in terms of time. Anybody reading this endless series in the Globe on cars, traffic the last 2 days? I mean, it's endless, it's too long. But one of the primary points that's made is we all talk a good game about this, and I'm at the top of the list, and very few people have given up their cars. All these politicians talking about, Tom Menino said, the cat is no longer king in Boston, and he provided all these parking spaces for every city county, and all that sort of stuff. And I think of myself and this is a horrible admission, as busy as I am, on Halloween, I will often call Chris and say, we're going to turn off the lights and I'm going to slink down on the couch so that no one, I'm sorry. So, and so maybe what I could do, as busy as I like to think I am, maybe I could answer the damn door for 3 hours and meet some of my neighbors. So I'm not at all disagreeing with you, but there are choices we all make, as busy as some of us are, that might allow us to interact and speak and hear other people more than we do, even within the confines of what we have. I'm sorry. Yes, hi.
No, that's okay. That was exactly where I was going. I think that technology offers great opportunities for connection and also keeps us from connecting. And I'm thinking about your bus driver. I happened to take the T today, and everybody's got their phones in their faces. So nobody's looking at each other, not connecting. I purposely did not take my phone out of my bag, and I just sat there and I looked at the entire subway car with their phones in their faces. And I think that goes back to what you were saying about the anonymity and back to being responsible. So if you can hide, if you don't have to connect with the person across from you, if you're not responsible for how you're interacting, how do we shift that?
I was giving a lecture in a class on Monday, and one of the things I did in the class is I asked people, because in our, we're kind of fortunate inside of MIT, particularly in our department, we just have people from all over the world, and they're kind of been out working for a while, and they've come into our 2-year program. And these are first-year graduate students in this program. And as I was talking to them about these issues of public engagement and civic dialogue, I basically said, so for those of you who are not from the United States, would you mind just standing up and telling and demonstrating for us what good public conversation looks like? And it was really fascinating, right? Some people got up and started screaming and hollering and saying, this is good conversation. We're having real conversation here. Other people had other different ways of doing it. We have no tolerance for that in this country, right? We have zero tolerance for it. And so in some sense, what we tell people, in order to enter the public sphere, you basically have to hide a lot of yourself. You can't be yourself in the public sphere because we can't tolerate that, right? And then you wonder, then people don't feel seen, right? They don't feel listened to because they can't authentically show up. And I have that problem because it scares me sometimes when people talk loud.
One more over here. Hi.
Hi. Yeah, I feel like we're sort of like on the topic of social media. I just wanted to bring up a specific instance that happened some months ago. I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was blocked a couple of people on Twitter, specifically white men who, she didn't agree with what they were saying. They were berating her. But it became kind of a legal issue because apparently that's a violation of those people's First Amendment right to have, the freedom to say what they want to her. And I guess that just really made me think a lot because, obviously on the side of like absolutist and like the equality, okay, yeah, I guess everyone should be able to say what they want. But I think it becomes very convoluted with something like social media. And, there are a lot of, it's still a relatively new thing, but now, people that are a little bit younger than us that are like in college are now just growing up with social media. So this is becoming kind of a norm for them. And it sort of touches on your point where like, I'm just curious of how we're gonna take things like this and kind of grow with them. And like, how is that going to affect, like, it just seems like very convoluted with like, what is like okay and why can't she block someone on Twitter that is, attacking her? And
she eventually, I think, apologized for, if I believe, for having done that, I think.
Which, sure, that's kind of ridiculous because like you had mentioned, the president says a lot of really intense things on Twitter and he hasn't apologized for a single thing. So I'm going back to responsibility and everything. I'm just curious to know like how that's going to affect like future generations going forward with this amendment.
Well, can I harken back to what this is not about to happen tomorrow, but I hugely believe that those who trade in hate speech on social media would be reduced in numbers dramatically if we knew who they were.
Yeah.
It's really easy to be brave and hostile and hateful if you're, you're in your mother's basement or whatever the expression is. No, I'm serious. And, I have to, one of the things, I know people know who Curt Schilling is? Curt Schilling, who, while a great baseball player, is a right-wing lunatic in many, many ways. He announced on Twitter, I'm going to get this slightly wrong, but the gist of it right, about 2 years ago, that his daughter had been accepted to some college and how proud he was of his kid. And the response on Twitter was the most disgusting, violent, hateful, misogynistic crap. And what he did, which I was cheering, I have to say, I don't know how he did it technologically, but he found out the identity of every single one of the men who were doing what they did, and he outed them. One was expelled from his college for having done this. And the point of that, I'm not suggesting we should all become crusaders and we can't. We don't have the person power or the skills, but it was a perfect example to me of the power of knowing who the speaker is. And my sense is as irresponsible as those people's thoughts are, the expression of their thoughts would be far less irresponsible if we knew who they were.
Yeah.
And read the Globe, which is, not exactly a radical. I read the comments often before I read the columns. Even the stuff that isn't blocked is unbelievable. Yeah. It is just unbelievable, horrible. And again, if I had to say Jim Braude, I'm assuming that a lot of that stuff wouldn't be said. So I guess that would be my first step before I think about banning some speeches, out people, and then take it from there, as painful as that was for her, and other people have been the victim of that.
Yeah, it's probably even more difficult now, though, because with social media, it's just, the numbers of people that are involved on that kind of thing it's just massive and growing and growing.
Well, they have bots, yeah, but you could also, I mean, again, it's imperfect, but without giving people a headache, the answer is you can't have a Twitter account or a Facebook account or whatever other than your username. You have to have your name attached to it or you can't open an account. And there may be ways to circumvent it, but maybe that's a start. So.
One more.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I agree about needing to leave anonymity aside. I think another thing is that what I learned long ago from a friend to teach our children before we speak is to ask ourselves if it's true, if it's necessary, and if it's kind. If that is something we can just spread further as a meme well beyond our families, if we're making public statements, that could help too.
What do you say to a kid today who says, why do I have to be truthful, kind, and whatever the other adjective was, when the President of the United States doesn't, no, I'm serious, I don't mean that as a facetious comment. What do you say to a little kid who says, I want to talk like him, he's the President of the United States, I want to treat people like he, how do you deal with that?
My kids were little in the 80s when Reagan was president and then Bush, and I realized as they were growing up, we had presidents I didn't agree with at all, and I let them know that I didn't. And I was well aware of the people whose lives they were ruining with their bad actions. So I wouldn't, if my grandchildren are now saying, why can't we behave like President Trump, I'd be saying, well, he's the devil incarnate, so don't behave like him.
That might be a great thing to end on, devil incarnate. So let's actually make a lot of noise now. Thank these guys. So I'm very cognizant of the fact that everyone wants to go home and make popcorn in time for the debate, but we do have some dessert, and spend a few more minutes with us, and thank you so much for coming. It's been a really interesting conversation. I feel like we could go on for hours.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you. It's really great to meet you. I will call you about things.